It was an interesting take, I thought, when I read your speech, that not knowing who was going to be the chair, what the president was going to do, might have delayed the Fed. But did you not see inflation coming at the time?
So I think it was, I think in the first half of 2021, I think it was very reasonable to believe that inflation was going to be a temporary phenomenon, that it was principally supply chain disruption driven. If you looked at the readings in the various elements of the inflation basket, there was really only one, this is well known at this time, that was driving the aggregate inflation print, and that was used car prices that had accelerated by 25% over a couple of months. That drove the aggregate number to be about 5% at the beginning of June, but it was just that one element, and everything else was not really showing signs of inflationary pressures at that time. So I think the Fed's actions were reasonable up through the middle of the summer, through the summer of 2021. I do think that by September, it was becoming clear that this was not primarily a supply chain disruption-driven inflation. It was a overstimulated demand-driven inflation. And at that point, in hindsight, I think it would have served the Fed well to move in September. Very difficult to determine that, at that point. But I think in hindsight, that's when we should have moved.
Well, the other thing that got everyone's attention is you saying that the Fed can bring down inflation, but they can't do it basically without recession.
Yeah, I think at this point that will be difficult to do. I mean, the Fed doesn't often manage to bring down inflation without triggering at least a small recession. I think particularly then when you have inflation this high and when you have a labor market this tight, trying to bring inflation down in that context is going to be hard to do without a brief recession. I'm not forecasting anything like 2008 or the early 1980s, anything like the structural problems that were in the 1970s. But I think the Fed will get on top of inflation. I don't have any doubt about that, and I think they'll do that fairly promptly. But I think that'll be hard to do without some brief recession.
So, Randy, can you kind of reflect a little bit, though, on some of the guidance that we got out of the Fed, including while you were there, this idea of what effectively amounted to a new framework, not only with regards to inflation targeting, but some of the commentary out of Powell about the importance that he was putting on the labor market and how that metric would be something that would probably drive Fed policy and the decision of when they would start to raise rates. And I'm wondering if those two were ever in real conflict. Was there real discussion about that?
So there's a lot of discussion around the framework. I think it's premature to conclude that where inflation is now is a per se refutation of the validity of the new framework. I think if you look at what the framework would have guided the Fed to do, which the way I've always phrased it, I've called it the Israel Putnam principle, which is what people are criticizing now. Israel Putnam was the general at Bunker Hill who said, don't fire until you see the whites of their eyes. And that's the principle the Fed has been following. But Israel Putnam did not say, let the redcoats march over you. And I think that there's great benefit in waiting for a period to see whether there's actually going to be inflation developing, particularly given the data that we were seeing during the first half of 2021. But by the fall of 2021, I think the framework that the Fed is operating under, again, this is much clearer in hindsight, would have said, now is the time to move. I think we should have moved then, and I think the framework the Fed is operating under would have guided the Fed to move then.
Randy, let's talk about the here and now then, and the tools that are currently able to be deployed. It's interesting that we're having Thomas Barkin over at the Richmond Fed saying, look, you shouldn't take 75 basis points off the table. You should keep all tools around you. You've got David Tepper, other money managers, saying actually it's an unforced error that Federal Reserve Chair Powell is making by saying that that's not in the agenda anymore. What do you make of it?
Yeah, I think there's still a lot of uncertainty about what the course of inflation is going to be over the future. I myself expect that interest rate policy is going to be more effective in the current environment than either the Fed or most economists are expecting it to be. And in that context, moving sort of robustly, but not draconianly, in the way that that Powell has suggested, which is in 50 basis point increments over the next couple of meetings, is the right way to go.
You have the distinction of being the first and so far only vice chair for supervision. You said that maybe monetary policy was affected by the nomination process. Do you think regulatory policy has been affected by the fact that they haven't been able to replace you?
So, well, I think that's unquestionable. With respect to monetary policy being affected by the nomination process, I do think that some of my comments have been a little misinterpreted. The only thing I was saying there was not that there was some calculation around the nomination process that was driving decisions at the Fed, but that any organization is going to be a little tentative in taking decisions, particularly consequential decisions, if it isn't sure that it's going to potentially be saddling new leadership with decisions that they wouldn't have taken. That's not even something that's consciously done. That's something that creates tentativeness in an organization. I think some folks have misinterpreted what I said there.
But we have lost by not having a vice chair for supervision.
So, there are a number of regulatory matters that are on the Fed's plate that really haven't moved forward in the absence of somebody to replace me. Probably the most important is that the last elements of the Basel III regulatory framework that has been agreed internationally that are supposed to be implemented by the end of this year have not even been proposed yet. And the Fed will be reluctant to propose them without somebody sitting in my chair.
One very quick question, supplementary leverage ratio. People have been worried about that because now the Fed's no longer buying treasuries, and because of that, banks don't want to warehouse them. Is that something that really needs to be fixed?
So I think that it does. I think that'll be one of the very first things on the agenda for Michael Barr, the person they've nominated to replace me. There are a lot of different ways to fix it, and that's what he'll have to choose among them. I had proposed one way, which is to turn the numerator of that ratio down. Other people have proposed, which is perfectly logical, although I think it would create additional problems, to take certain things out of the denominator rather than to turn the numerator down. He'll have to make those decisions.